Okay, so our next video pertains to Major Study Designs Part 3, and it's about clinical trials, experimental trials. So experimental studies, we actually collect data from the individual. I'm going to speak about an example intervention study. We're going to briefly speak about community clinical trials, natural designs. I'll mention something about the ethics and strengths and weaknesses of these. So an example experimental trial, or in this case an intervention trial. Anytime you hear the word trial, you gotta be thinking that the person or persons who are doing the study are actually altering something. They're changing something. They're giving somebody something. They're taking something away from somebody, or they're providing an education of some type, or giving people the opportunity to participate in some sort of program. And then another group gets to either participate in a different kind of program or gets nothing at all, or gets something that is a sham, it's fake. So a lot of people think about clinical trials where maybe a medicine is given to somebody and then somebody else gets a different kind of medicine, and they compare the health outcomes among those who got the new medicine versus the other medicine, or in some cases a sugar pill. So in this example, it's a household-based ceramic water filter for the prevention of diarrhea, a randomized controlled trial of a pilot program in Colombia. In this particular example, Oxfam International, Oxfam Great Britain, they provided these ceramic water filters to a certain community, and they were interested in seeing the diarrhea rates for those that had the water filters versus those who didn't. And there's a couple different ways you could do this kind of study. You could measure the diarrhea rates for a few years in a community that has no water treatment, and then come into the community and install these water filters and then measure the diarrhea rates later as kind of a within group community trial. Or you could show up and measure the diarrheal rates in one community and measure it in a community that's different, and one of the communities gets actual ceramic water filters and the other one doesn't, and then you measure maybe the water quality coming in and out of those water filters, but then you're going to measure the frequency of diarrhea in the individuals who have and who do not have the actual functioning ceramic water filter. So that's kind of an example of an experimental trial or an interventional trial. So thinking back to cross-sectional, do you notice something? Like in cross-sectional, there was no assigning an exposure. In this case, there's an actual assignment of exposure. That assignment can happen at random, where maybe it's the roll of a dice or pulling a random number, or it could be the investigator just chooses. The random approach is going to be the least biased, but needless to say, when investigators or researchers are assigning things, then you're definitely in the realm of doing an experimental trial. We think of this a lot with animals and toxicology studies and mice and so forth, where something's being assigned to the animal, and they usually don't have the same level of treatment as humans get. So there's greater ethical concerns that tend to appear among humans, but animals, they do get certain protections, particularly those that have backbones. So what makes something an experimental study? Well, an experimental study is an evaluation of some sort of assigned intervention, an exposure, or maybe a dose, or we maybe assign some sort of behavior. And then we have maybe an assigned set of conditions, and then we evaluate a hypothesis or hypotheses. Did we increase or decrease the outcome of interest? That kind of stuff. Unlike other epidemiology studies and other studies in biostatistics that might be done, or even in biology they do these things, the exposure is controlled by the people doing the study. They develop the program, the protocol for who gets what. It could be by random chance. There could be some way in which they do it. The other epidemiology studies, we've already spoke about cross-sectional studies. The other types of studies that we speak about in this class are case control and cohort studies. Those are observational studies in the sense that there's no assignment of the exposure. So again, the exposure is controlled by the investigator or the protocol set out by the investigator. It does present ethical dilemmas, especially if you're giving out something good and somebody ends up in the control group and they didn't want to be in the control group. And if you tell them, that might change their behavior. So ideally, a random approach maximizes variability, but we still have that dilemma of who does not get the treatment or the intervention. Ideally, they should always be getting the best available treatment for like an illness. It'd be unethical otherwise to take away a treatment for an illness. But regardless, it is sometimes a challenge, turning people away from something that might be really good for them. We don't know, though. We have the other dilemma that if a group gets something that's not what they wanted, how do you trick the group into not knowing what they got or into thinking they got something better? And I don't know if trickery is the best word, but it kind of is that way. They're not allowed to know, and they might have entered a study with the hope that they were participating and they should know or be told that they could get nothing at all or the best available treatment or what they've always been getting. So we have to do that to guard against this thing called the placebo effect, where something that may be inactive or not have an effect, if they get it, they might think it will make them feel better. So we will sometimes see a placebo given to see what the psychological response of a person is to make them feel better or report better outcomes or whatever it might be. Sometimes that's also known as the sham treatment. So there are a lot of challenges when people do these types of studies, like what interventions should be used, who do you recruit, what do you measure, who becomes your comparison group, is it at random, if it's not at random, if there's one group that gets the water filters, which community doesn't get the water filters, or one community gets the new great tobacco cessation program, the other group gets some classroom that doesn't really produce the results we want. And then if somebody's getting a drug or getting some sort of thing to make them feel better or some sort of education, and they've been assigned to get that exposure, how do you ensure that they keep going or participating? Especially if it's boring, if it's an education thing, or if it's a drug and it's making them sick. How do they, or making them think they feel sick, or they're not feeling better, so they want to give up on it? How do you ensure people continue to participate? So those are potential challenges with experimental trials when you're dealing with humans. And there are all kinds of other ones. So what are you measuring? You need to know what you're measuring, but are there other things you should be measuring? And then if people do get sick or start to feel sick, they should be able to leave the study at any time. But when should you stop the study? If somebody has a heart attack while on a medication, should they be able to stop? So those types of things often have to be considered as well. So there's a lot of strengths and weaknesses, and you can kind of look over these. You can pause it and read them. But for biostats, we're not going to belabor these too much. These are more epidemiology in nature, and just ethically, we have the same problems when you do research methods in epidemiology. These types of studies are really challenging. You have to have a lot of support from review boards and make sure you've done everything correctly, because people who are in the control group or the no exposure group ought to know. You can't hide information from people. When people have things like syphilis, they should be told. Unlike Dr. Cutler's studies in Tuskeegee, Alabama, and also in Guatemala. So if you were to Google search Guatemala Cutler studies, you'll see some pretty horrible things where there's some reason to believe that we had the U.S. government through Cutler whether or not knowingly or unknowingly had infected these people in Guatemala and possibly done the same thing in Tuskegee. We don't know if he actually gave people in Tuskegee the disease, but he definitely didn't give people the treatment for syphilis just so he could monitor it. But in Guatemala, there's reason to believe that certain people were given syphilis through either prostitutes or potentially even injections. So it's kind of, pretty horrible stuff in that case. So there's ethical concerns. You can't just study anything and assign exposures to people, and people deserve to be given proper protections. So there's a lot of other examples there. So the next area we're going to go into will be analytical epidemiology and case control studies is the next design, and we'll start there here in a minute.